Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
You know how some families pretend that everything is fair, that they love all their kids equally, and that no one is the favorite? Well, mine never even bothered with that act, and I think that's what still stings the most. From as far back as I can remember, Daniel was the one who got the applause, the money, the big gifts, the loud bragging calls to relatives, while I was the one who got a pat on the back with a half-hearted "good job" if I was lucky. He would come home with a trophy from a school game, and my mom would plan a celebration dinner. I would bring home straight A's after pulling all-nighters, and she would say, "That's what's expected of you." They didn't hide the favoritism, they wore it like a badge, as if it made sense that one child deserved to be lifted on a pedestal while the other just blended into the background like furniture. I thought for years that maybe if I worked harder, if I went above and beyond, they would finally see me, but that was a losing game from the start. Daniel didn't have to lift a finger. He was simply the son, the golden child, the heir to their pride, while I was the extra, the spare, the one who could fend for herself because she was independent. Independent was the word they used when they wanted to justify not showing up. Independent was the excuse for leaving me out, for not paying attention, for pretending my needs didn't matter. You learn early on that if you want to survive, you stop expecting people who never saw you in the first place to suddenly open their eyes. The moment it really started to sink in was when my car broke down during college. I called my parents, embarrassed, telling them I just needed a little help to get to work and classes, and they said they couldn't possibly help me, that things were tight, and I should learn to budget better. I remember hanging up that phone and thinking maybe they were right. Maybe I just needed to suck it up, until 2 weeks later I saw the giant red bow on Daniel's brand new truck that they had gifted him, just because he deserved it. That's when I realized it wasn't about money at all. It was about who they wanted to invest in, and I was not on that list. So when I started working, every paycheck felt like survival, and every overtime shift felt like punishment for being born second. I didn't complain because who would listen? If I even dared to say anything, my mom would remind me that I was lucky to have a job at all, while Daniel was praised for taking breaks between jobs to find himself. When you grow up in that kind of environment, bitterness becomes second nature, but so does silence. You stop trying to argue because arguing just feeds them reasons to dismiss you. Silence becomes your weapon, and honestly, it's sharper than words because they never know what's brewing underneath it. I remember sitting in the break room at work one evening, drained from a 12-hour shift, staring at a bag of vending machine crackers I didn't even want, scrolling through my phone just to distract myself, when the pictures popped up. There they were, all three of them, standing at the dock, sunglasses on, drinks in hand, about to board a yacht for Daniel's big celebration trip. The caption was sickening, "Proud of our boy, so well deserved." I wanted to laugh because it was so predictable, but I felt something else instead. It wasn't jealousy, and it wasn't sadness either. It was like something snapped into place, a hard clarity I had never felt before. In that moment, I understood that I had wasted too many years trying to be seen by people who would never care to look. They didn't see me when I succeeded, they didn't see me when I struggled, and they sure as hell weren't going to see me now while I was working myself into the ground to afford rent and groceries. But I also knew one thing. I was done being the ghost in their story. I wasn't going to shout, I wasn't going to beg, and I wasn't going to explain myself anymore. That was the exact night I started thinking differently. If they wanted to play favorites, fine. If they wanted to act like I didn't exist, fine. I would let them believe that. But when they came home, when the yacht trip was over and they walked back into that house expecting things to be the same, they would finally notice me, not because I screamed, not because I argued, but because of what I would leave behind. And I swear to you, the thought of that made me smile for the first time in years. When people talk about family, they usually describe it as this unshakable support system that catches you when you fall, celebrates you when you win, and gives you strength when you have nothing left. But for me, family was more like a mirror that only showed me the places where I was invisible, because every time I needed help, the response was always the same: excuses, dismissals, and reminders that I should figure things out on my own. While my brother was handed every cushion, every safety net, and every unearned round of applause that money could buy. I learned early on that I could not rely on them, And so I threw myself into work, because if I couldn't count on family, at least I could count on myself to survive. Though that survival came at a cost I felt in my bones every night, I dragged myself home after yet another overtime shift. The job itself was not glamorous, and I never pretended that it was, but it paid the bills, even if barely, and as long as I picked up the extra hours and covered for people who couldn't be bothered to show up, I could keep the lights on, keep some food in the fridge, and avoid the constant panic of falling behind on rent. I remember nights when I would come home so exhausted that I didn't even have the energy to cook, and I would stand in the kitchen eating a piece of bread because it was all I could manage before collapsing into bed. And even then I would wake up before dawn with my stomach twisted in knots, not just from hunger, but from the crushing pressure of knowing this cycle would repeat itself tomorrow and the day after that. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask my parents for a little help, not even money, just maybe a bit of understanding, maybe a ride to save me from taking the bus home after a 16-hour shift, or a meal that I could reheat after work, they would sigh, act as though I was asking for the world, and remind me that I was an adult and adults were supposed to handle their own problems. The irony, of course, was that this philosophy never applied to Daniel. When he called them in the middle of the night because he had run out of gas on some road trip, my dad was out the door with a gas can before Daniel could even hang up. When he forgot to pay his insurance, my mom not only covered it, she bragged about how parents should always step up for their children. But for me, I was the independent one, the strong one, the one who didn't need them. At least that's the lie they told themselves to make their neglect feel like wisdom. I stopped asking eventually, not because I didn't need anything, but because it became humiliating to hear the same hollow lines over and over. They would say, "We don't have extra money right now," even as I saw pictures of the new furniture they bought, the vacations they booked, and the endless stream of surprise gifts for Daniel. I remember once asking if they could help me with a dental bill after an emergency, and my mom shook her head and told me healthcare costs were just something everyone had to shoulder on their own. Less than a week later, Daniel posted a picture of himself with a shiny new watch that they had given him for working so hard. I stared at that picture for a long time, trying to understand how my pain and my struggles didn't even register with them, how they could look at their two children and decide only one deserved comfort, while the other deserved lessons about grit. So I kept my mouth shut, I worked my hours, I let the bitterness calcify into something harder, and I realized that silence was more powerful than pleading. Words never changed them, arguments only gave them more material to throw back in my face, but silence gave me space to think, to plan, to figure out how I could turn the tables without saying a word. And the more silent I became, the more detached I grew from the fantasy that they would ever see me as worthy of the same love and effort they poured into Daniel. One night, after a particularly grueling double shift, I came home and collapsed onto the couch, and in that moment, I decided something that would shape everything that followed. I was done trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I was expendable. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I didn't even feel anger the way I used to. What I felt was a strange kind of calm, the calm that comes when you finally stop fighting a losing battle. That was also the night I understood that revenge didn't have to come from loud confrontations or desperate attempts to be heard. Sometimes the sharpest blow is delivered quietly, with no warning, and with a precision that leaves the other person stunned because they never saw it coming. And as I lay there in the dark, my body aching from exhaustion, but my mind sharper than it had been in years, I started sketching out an idea in my head, an idea that didn't involve raising my voice or begging for recognition. It was the idea of letting my silence do the talking, and I knew, deep down, that silence was going to speak louder than anything I could ever say. The week my parents left for the yacht trip with Daniel was the week everything I had buried inside me finally demanded to be faced, because while they were packing their expensive luggage and posting pictures of champagne glasses clinking before they even stepped on board, I was clocking into yet another overnight shift with barely enough energy to keep myself upright, and I realized that it wasn't just unfair treatment anymore, it was a statement from them, loud and clear, that I didn't matter enough to even consider inviting, that my exhaustion and my sacrifices were invisible to them, and that the only story they wanted to tell the world was the one where Daniel was the shining sun being rewarded again and again. I had seen favoritism before. I had lived with it my entire life, but there was something different about this particular trip, something about the extravagance of it, about the way my mom captioned the photos with phrases like, "our proudest moment yet," and "he's everything we dreamed he'd be," that made it sting like nothing before, because it wasn't just about them giving him more, it was about them deliberately erasing me, acting as though their family began and ended with the three of them. Smiling on that deck while I existed only on the sidelines, and I knew then that I was done watching from the outside, while pretending I could swallow the bitterness without consequence. During those nights while they were gone, I worked shifts that stretched into mornings, and I remember sitting in the break room at 4 in the morning with my body screaming for rest, scrolling through their endless updates, the laughing, the sun-soaked faces, the comments from friends praising them for being such a close family, and I thought about how absurd it was, how fake, how perfectly staged, and I asked myself what I was really doing, why I was still giving my energy and my time to people who didn't even acknowledge I existed when the cameras were pointed their way, and the answer that came back was brutal but freeing. I was doing it because I was too afraid to admit I could walk away. That fear started to crumble as I thought about the reality of my life, about how every bill, every medical cost, every broken appliance had been shouldered by me alone, while Daniel coasted on their endless generosity without so much as a thank you. And I realized that maybe I had been wrong to believe my silence was just about protecting myself, because maybe it could also become the sharpest weapon I had, the one thing that could finally slice through the false image they clung to, and expose them to the kind of emptiness they had left me with all these years. I began to plan, not in some dramatic, overnight burst of rage, but in the steady, methodical way you plan when you've been holding back for too long and you know you only get one real chance to make it count. And while they sipped cocktails and smiled for the camera, I started making decisions that would change everything they thought they knew about me. I went through my things, deciding what was worth keeping and what could be left behind, and as I packed the first box, I felt this strange lightness, not sadness, not regret, but a kind of release. Like I had been dragging a weight behind me for years and finally understood that I could just set it down and walk away. The more I thought about it, the more clear it became that leaving was not going to be the defeat they would want to imagine, but the victory I had been building toward quietly for years, because if they wanted to pretend I was invisible, then I would make sure my absence screamed louder than my presence ever could, and I would make sure that when they walked back into that house, expecting everything to be just as they left it, the reality waiting for them would be undeniable. One night, after a double shift, I sat at my kitchen table and began writing, not a letter of apology, not a letter begging for acknowledgement, but something sharp and deliberate. Words that carried the years of silence I had endured and turned them into a weapon they could never unsee. I folded that paper slowly, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in my bag, knowing exactly where it would rest when the time came. As I zipped up my final bag, I felt a calmness that almost scared me with its intensity, because I knew that what I was about to do would not just hurt them, it would expose them. It would strip away the comfortable lie they had built around Daniel and force them to face what they had done to me, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of how they would react. And as I turned off the light that night, I said to myself what I had never dared to before. When they came home, I wouldn't be there to listen to their excuses, I wouldn't be there to be dismissed or ignored, but I would leave behind something that would make sure they could never again pretend I didn't exist. Because sometimes silence is not emptiness, sometimes silence is the loudest scream they will ever hear. The day they set sail on that yacht, I began the process of untangling myself from everything that had tied me down to them for far too long. Because I finally understood that the only way to make them feel the sharp edge of what they had done to me was not through another argument or another tearful plea that would end with me being told I was overreacting, but through an action so complete and so irreversible that it would leave them with no option but to recognize that I was no longer the quiet background character in their golden boy story, but someone who had quietly outmaneuvered them while they were too busy clinking glasses on a rented deck to notice what was happening right under their noses. I started small, sorting through my belongings in silence, making decisions that felt both terrifying and liberating, choosing what to keep because it held meaning to me and what to abandon because it was tied to the years of neglect that had shaped me. And with every bag I filled and every drawer I emptied, I felt the weight I had carried since childhood begin to lift in a way I never thought possible. As I folded my clothes and stacked them in boxes, I thought about every time I had sat in that house hoping they would look at me with the same pride they reserved exclusively for Daniel, and I realized that this act of leaving was not just about escape. It was about reclaiming something they had stolen from me without even acknowledging it, my right to be seen, to be valued, to exist as more than an afterthought. I packed carefully, not in a rush, because this wasn't some impulsive runaway moment. It was the calm execution of a plan that had been forming for years, the natural conclusion of a lifetime of being told through their actions that I was expendable. The silence of the house became my ally, because in that silence I could hear my own thoughts clearly for once, without their constant chatter about Daniel's accomplishments drowning me out. And what those thoughts told me was that it was time to stop clinging to scraps of affection and start writing my own narrative, one they could not edit out of family stories or brush aside with a dismissive laugh. I stacked the final boxes neatly, taped them shut, and lined them by the door, and each time I did, I imagined them walking into this house, exhausted from their luxury trip, expecting to see everything exactly where they left it, only to realize that I was no longer there, that my absence was not a fluke or a tantrum, but a deliberate choice I had made with full clarity. But the heart of my plan was not just to leave, it was to leave behind something that would force them to confront what they had done, something they could not ignore or rewrite, and so I sat down at the kitchen table. The same table where I had spent countless dinners listening to conversations that excluded me, and I placed the envelope in the center with a precision that made me feel like I was setting a trap, because in many ways that's exactly what it was. Inside that envelope were not apologies or explanations, because I had nothing left to apologize for and nothing I cared to explain, but documents and words that carried the weight of years they had brushed aside. Words that exposed truths they had tried to bury under their endless praise for Daniel, and proof that while they were distracted with their perfect image of family, I had taken steps they would never have imagined I was capable of. I won't pretend that writing those words was easy, because every sentence carried memories I had spent years trying to suppress, but instead of writing them as pleas for understanding, I wrote them as statements of fact, unshakable, undeniable. The kind of truths that don't need anyone's approval to exist. I explained how every time they told me they had no money, I saw them turn around and buy Daniel something new. I explained how they dismissed my struggles as lessons while cushioning his mistakes as temporary setbacks. I explained how their silence when I needed them taught me to stop asking, but that silence had not broken me, it had sharpened me. Alongside those words, I placed documents they had forgotten existed, legal papers connected to something my grandmother had left in my name, something they had always assumed I would hand over to Daniel without protest. And with those papers I made it clear that not only was I not giving it away, I had already acted in a way that ensured they could never touch it again. When I sealed that envelope and laid it on the table, I felt a satisfaction so deep it startled me, because I knew that envelope was more than paper. It was the sum total of every neglected moment, every insult disguised as advice, every opportunity they gave to Daniel while telling me to fend for myself, and once they opened it, they could never go back to pretending I didn't exist. I walked through the house one last time, not to say goodbye, but to confirm that everything was in place exactly as I wanted it, the boxes stacked neatly, the room stripped of my presence, the kitchen table waiting quietly with its single, devastating offering. When I finally closed the front door behind me, I didn't look back, because looking back would have meant there was still a part of me hoping for them to notice, and I was done hoping. I stepped away with nothing but my bags and the knowledge that when they returned, the silence they had forced on me for years would finally speak louder than their yacht trips, their celebrations, and their endless excuses. And though I didn't hear it yet, I could already imagine the sound that would break the moment they opened that envelope, the scream that told me my silence had finally been heard. When they finally came back from their yacht trip, glowing with the smug satisfaction of people who believe the world exists to serve them, I was already gone, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel like the one who had been left behind. but rather like the one who had taken the first step out of a cage they had built for me since childhood, because the truth was that my absence was no accident, no emotional outburst, and no temporary rebellion, but the final move in a game they didn't even realize I had been playing. They walked through that front door expecting the same scenery they had left behind. Daniel's shoes by the door, my silence lingering like background noise, my presence tucked somewhere out of sight, but ready to be summoned if they needed to dismiss me again. Instead, they were greeted by an emptiness that didn't ask for permission, an emptiness that made itself known in the cleared-out shelves, the missing clothes, the absence of anything that tied me to them. But it wasn't the emptiness that rattled them most. It was what I left behind on the kitchen table, lying perfectly in the center as though I had placed it there with the precision of someone who wanted to make sure it couldn't be ignored. My mother was the first to see it, and I have no doubt her heart skipped when her eyes landed on that plain envelope, because for all the years she told herself I was the independent one, the quiet one, the one who could be overlooked without consequence. There was still a part of her that knew she had planted the seeds of something dangerous, and that envelope was proof it had finally taken root. She opened it, and I imagine her fingers trembling not because she feared losing me, but because she feared losing control, and the moment she saw the documents inside, she screamed, not a cry of grief, not even anger in the traditional sense, but the guttural reaction of someone who suddenly realizes they are no longer in charge of the narrative they had written so carefully for themselves. Inside that envelope was my voice in its purest form, written not as a plea for acknowledgement, but as a verdict, a cold recounting of every injustice I had endured, every time they told me they were broke while financing Daniel's whims, every time they dismissed my pain as resilience while cushioning his mistakes as opportunities, every time they convinced themselves that neglect was wisdom, favoritism was parenting, and cruelty was love. But alongside that verdict was something far more tangible, something that went beyond words and into the realm of consequence. Because enclosed with my letter were the legal documents proving that I had taken control of the one thing they had always assumed belonged to Daniel, the inheritance my grandmother had left in my name. The small piece of property they had always spoken of as though it were his by birthright, ignoring that the deed bore my name, not his, and that I had the sole authority to decide its fate. For years I let them speak of it as though it were already his, because it was easier than correcting them, but while they were floating on the open sea drinking champagne, I signed the papers that transferred it permanently beyond their reach, securing it in a way that no lawyer of theirs could undo. My letter explained it all. Explained how I had stayed silent not because I was weak but because I was patient, how I had waited for the moment when my silence could no longer be interpreted as submission but instead as strategy, and how every dismissal, every slight, every cruel reminder that I was second best had been recorded in me until the day I chose to let that silence erupt into a move they could not erase. I ended it not with bitterness, not with pleas, but with a final line that I knew would echo in that kitchen long after the envelope was empty. For years you told me I was independent, that I could handle everything on my own, so I did. When my mother screamed, I imagine my father stood frozen, because he was never the one to raise his voice. He was the one who justified everything with quiet excuses, and in that moment, excuses would have been useless. Daniel, of course, would be angry, indignant, unable to comprehend how the golden son could lose something he never actually owned. But that anger would only reveal the truth I had written. He had lived his entire life on gifts that weren't his to earn, while I had built my life on survival they pretended didn't exist. The beauty of it all was that I didn't have to be there to see their faces, to hear their arguments, to listen to the sudden shift from arrogance to panic. Because the brilliance of revenge is not in watching it unfold, but in knowing that it cannot be stopped once it begins, and by the time they opened that envelope, everything was already settled. I was gone, my new life was already beginning, and the ties that bound me to them had been severed not with screaming, not with begging, but with quiet paperwork and carefully chosen words that hit harder than anything I could have shouted. I think about them sometimes, sitting in that kitchen, Daniel demanding answers, my mother clutching the letter with shaking hands, my father trying to salvage dignity from a situation that exposed their failures in a way no argument ever could. And I wonder if they finally looked at each other and realized that their golden image had cracked, that their silence had bred something they could not contain. I wonder if they finally understood what it felt like to be blindsided, to be dismissed, to be rendered powerless. And as for me, I carry no guilt, because for once in my life, I was not the forgotten daughter waiting for scraps of affection, but the architect of an ending they never anticipated, the one who walked away not in defeat, but in victory. And the one whose silence had finally been heard louder than any of their cheers for Daniel ever were. Because in the end, I did not leave them with nothing, I left them with the truth, and the truth was the one thing they never knew how to handle.